I came into this club in 1972, probably before some of you guys were born. And so I came in as, my classification was physician/obstetrics. So part of my training was down at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. And I worked in the emergency room. They had the busiest emergency room, well, the only trauma center in Dallas, so we saw everything that would come through there. And some of the people would come in, some of the interesting stories that I have were because the people have gotten a little bit hard of hearing. And one of them I remembered, an elderly lady came in with chest pain, and so I listened to her heart, then I listened to her lungs, and when I put my stethoscope over her lungs, I said, big breaths, and she looked up at me and she said, yes, when I was younger. So anyway, so, and then another one, so an elderly gentleman came in, and he had chest pain. So I went over him, listened to his heart and lungs, and when I got through examining him, I turned and I said, get me a nurse. And I looked back, and I looked at him, and he turned pale, and his eyeballs got big, and he started sweating and jumping around. I said, what's the matter? And he says, well, it's what you said. I said, look, you're going to be fine. And I said, you're okay. He said, well, why did you tell that nurse to get, I said, why didn't you tell them to get a hearse? And I said, I told him to get a nurse. But probably one of the embarrassing times was when I was working in an emergency room, this young fellow comes running in, and he says, my wife's out there in the taxi. She said she's having a baby. I need help. So I'll go charging out. I grab my emergency room delivery kit, and I go charging out there to the taxi and open the back door, and the lady's in the back seat, and I push up her skirt and get ready to pull down her undergarments, and I said to myself, this lady's not pregnant, see? So I looked around, and darn, I was in the wrong darn cab. So, I mean, those things happen, So, but after I got through with that emergency room, which I barely survived, then I went to the well baby clinic. And the well baby clinic is where they take the newborns after they've been home for a few weeks. So I was there. Now, this little baby came in to be checked, and I checked the baby over, weight and everything. And I looked on the growth curve, the scale there, and the baby was behind in its weight. So I said to the mother, I said, is this baby bottle fed or breastfed? And she said, breastfed. So I said, well, I need to check your breast. And so the lady, I checked her breast, and everything was okay. And I said, no wonder this baby is behind on its weight gain. I said, because you don't have any milk. She said, I know, I'm the grandmother. So,
a junior officer such as myself has the privilege and honor to introduce someone of such elevated rank and resume as I do today. Our speaker retired last month as a brigadier general in the United States Air Force. A 1982 graduate of Seneca High School, many have described him as Louisville's own general for some of these reasons. First, he flew with the Thunderbirds in our very own Thunder over Louisville. He saw his first combat missions as a fighter pilot in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. He has also served us in Iraqi Freedom in Afghanistan. He has been trained at Maxwell School as well as Harvard Kennedy School. His list and accomplishments of staff and combat operations is unparalleled in today's age. He has went on to brief the CIA, the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, as well as the President of the United States. Quite candidly, ladies and gentlemen, he's one of the best and brightest military minds of a generation. And he's my friend, and I'm happy to have him here today to talk to you all. Without further ado, Brigadier General Robert Gibbons.
You don't know how long-winded I can actually be. I will do my best to keep things rolling. Hopefully I can learn to use a microphone. As a commander, I never really liked it, but that always put me out in the middle in front of everybody, which often made the audience uncomfortable. Let me start by saying any organization where one of the initial speakers can get up and say breast, undergarments, and back of a cab in a speech is my kind of organization. Certainly, those of you who find that all acceptable have not had any dealings with the U.S. government in the past 5 years, where I don't even think we're allowed to say the Pledge of Allegiance, to be honest, because someone might be offended. But being retired, it gives me a whole new liberty to speak, and I certainly will take that opportunity every chance I get, so hold on, and please don't quote me. The other thing, too, is that, there are these things called cell phones now that take pictures, and sometimes some of the comments that you use will end up on the internet, so I can't wait to hear YouTube that breast story later on today. So thank you. I'm very honored to get a chance to come, back to my hometown and speak to such a distinguished group as the Rotary Club. And it was, of course, a bit of a shock to me to realize that it was not the car club, and that it was a little bit more involved when I realized what Rotary meant as, rotating through different people's offices. So I will do my best to try and give you a little bit of an insight into some of the experiences I have had. I had a chance to speak to a conference of state troopers from around the nation just the other day, and I was very intimidated by the fact that all of those ladies and gentlemen were armed. So if the speech went bad, I ran the risk of being shot. And I thought this would be a much lower key group until I realized that now I'm giving a speech in front of current employers, potentially future employers, business colleagues, and neighbors. So if this goes south, it's going to be a long 20, 30 years for me. And having moved 21 times in the past 27 of my military career, I don't intend on leaving Louisville ever again. Well, maybe one more time. Thank you. But it'll be on a one-way trip to Butler County, where my family has made their residence for the past 200 years. So thank you very much for bringing me in. I thought, and it's odd that it's after lunch, luckily, as opposed to before lunch, because I'm going to talk about some of the ugliness of the sausage making of national security. And I'm going to do this through giving you some anecdotes, because I live my life by anecdotes. So I thought I would share with you a couple of instances that I've been exposed to pretty much national security at the highest levels, and let you see how ugly it can possibly be at times, and how diluted it can be, and how it can also be no different than your day-to-day lives in your businesses here in Louisville. You always want to assume, right, that the best and brightest people are running the show for national security, and that we are safe and everything is well thought out and all contingencies are planned. But if you've ever spent any time in the Pentagon, you'll know that this isn't always the case. While there are great Americans and incredibly brilliant people, far more brilliant than me, despite what the ensign decided to say, and I'm sorry, Lucas, but it is the job of junior officers to introduce senior officers, but we'll work on that one. But so you get the first inkling in the Pentagon when you go into the restrooms. How is it possible that the best and brightest defense minds of the United States cannot hit a urinal? And by the end of the day, you don't want to be anywhere near a restroom in the Pentagon. So just take that as I discuss these next things and understand what you're really dealing with. My first real experience with national security, besides combat operations, as a practitioner of combat, was when I was a special assistant for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at that time Admiral Mike Mullen. This was August 2008. I had been a special assistant for the chairman for a whopping about 3 weeks. I'm not really sure he knew my name. I'm still not sure he knows my name. But I was in his office as a note taker for a couple of meetings, and it was a dead time in between meetings, different groups. And if you want to see somebody that's petitioned on a regular basis, I'm sure most of you in your businesses are besieged by people looking for money for a variety of different things. Imagine what the chairman goes through, different groups wanting to sell their agenda continually throughout the day. But it's in between meetings, and Vice Admiral Winnefeld, who at that point in time was the Director of Strategy and Policy for the Joint Staff, comes running in. And Admiral Winnefeld, as a former Navy fighter pilot, was normally pretty low-key, but he was obviously very excited when he comes running into the office. So there's me, Admiral Mullen, and Vice Admiral Winnefeld in the office, and I'm trying to shrink and blend into the wall when the Vice Admiral says, Chairman, the General Makarov, the Russian Chief of Defense, is on the phone and needs to speak to you urgently. Since I'd not heard any sirens, I assumed we probably weren't under attack, but the Admiral picks up the phone and he always had a very stoic look on his face anyway. I don't know if any of you all have the pleasure of knowing Admiral Mullen, but he is really even-keeled and very stoic. But I see him shake his head, he takes his glasses off, he's rubbing his eyes, and he's saying, yes, yes, and I understand. And then when he said the words, confirm you are not going to Tbilisi, did I realize that things were really going wrong. And what he was referring to is General Makarov had called the admiral to inform him that Russian offensive forces had taken action against the Republic of Georgia in the province of South Ossetia. And what entailed for the next week, of course, was what we geeks call the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, and resulted in the Russians securing Abkhazia and South Ossetia from Georgia as independent republics, and the removal of the government in Georgia eventually through political means. But for a brief period, the entire Joint Staff was set on its ear. And the admiral was surprised, the national security environment was surprised, and when things like that happen, you would be shocked at some of the things that come out of the woodwork. Instantly, there was a recall of the National Security Council and advisors to the president, then President Bush, and the Joint Staff goes into high gear. Sometimes people lose their minds in crises. This was a case where you'd be shocked at what some people recommended. There were recommendations across the board which were stock answers to crisis problems but did not fit in this case, such as the recommendation to fly unmanned U.S. reconnaissance aircraft over the battle area to be able to monitor Russian troop movements. While this works in Somalia, this does not work in an environment where advanced surface-to-air missiles have already shot down Georgian aircraft, and Georgian advanced surface-to-air missiles have already shot down Russian aircraft. And our 200-mile-an-hour unmanned spy drone wasn't going to stand a chance. And what do we do when the Russians shoot it down? How do we respond? Do we break the Treaty of Montrose, which, a little-known treaty signed in 1922, limits the capital or the size of capital ships that can go into the Black Sea, of which we are a signatory? Do we break the treaty and send warships into the Black Sea to show resolve for the United States? Luckily, calmer heads prevailed, and we were able to slowly back away from what could have been a very nasty confrontation with the Russians. But we learned some important lessons, primarily that U.S. power is indeed limited, and there are still adversaries out there, given their size, their location, and their intent. And the Russians were very pissed at the Georgians. And their intent, there's only so much that we can do. But more importantly, the admiral felt completely shocked and surprised by this event. When questioned about what was the most significant event of your first term as chairman, he said, "I was surprised by the invasion of Georgia," which then became a task for the special assistants. What I found was amazing, that 6 months prior to the Russian invasion of Georgia, a 23-year-old intel analyst in the basement of the Pentagon that worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency had nailed it, almost to the day. She knew the units that would be involved, she knew the attack routes, and the only thing that she got wrong was that it was going to be over South Ossetia as opposed to Abkhazia. She thought that the Russians would pick a fight with Georgia over Abkhazia, not South Ossetia. So, we'll spot her the 40 miles difference. And the trigger that she figured was the acceptance of, the Western acceptance of Kosovo as an independent republic, independent of Serbia. It was a de facto independence, but when we officially came out, and almost to the day, 6 months later, the combat was engineered between Georgia and Russia. The whole point to that is that here an intel analyst had figured everything out, had written a very, very well thought out report, submitted it up, and it made it up to the chairman's office somewhere, but nobody ever read it or saw it coming. And we were completely surprised by that. And a surprise which could have been detrimental to the United States. So it was amazing that we were able to get through that crisis, but the admiral after that, to correct that failing in intelligence, and it wasn't a failing in intelligence, it was a failing in decision makers to read intelligence, tasked us as the special assistants, there were 4 of us at the time, to start being his contrarians, to go out and canvass all of the intelligence possible and give him the things that people weren't telling him. Luckily, that resulted in the stopping of the sale of S-300 advanced surface-to-air missiles from Russia to Iran. We were able to detect this, see what was coming, and the admiral was able, through military means, and then, of course, with the rest of government behind him, to be able to stop the Russians from agreeing and going ahead with the sale that they had already made. The issue was that the Israelis swore that if those missiles were deployed into Iran around the nuclear sites, that they'd strike before they became operational. So luckily, we were able to head that one off. As well, we were able to determine advances in Chinese weaponry, and none of this, of course, is classified. And it's not because I'd have to kill you, it's because they'd arrest me. The threat of death for classified material is really the joke. The serious threat is spending a lot of time in Leavenworth, and nobody wants that. The Chinese developed certain technical advances to their weaponry, which were going to make the correlation of forces in the Pacific balance in favor of China. So as you watch today and you see discussions about Chinese military and their capability, while on a great strategic level, we're probably still a stronger military power than China, there are opportunities the Chinese have at a very local level to deal some significant damage to the U.S. forces. By bringing this to the attention, seeing this in 2009, was the genesis of the start to the shift and pivot to the Pacific, and for a variety of other reasons, but at least the military concern that the Pacific is a bigger issue for us than the Middle East, especially with Chinese weaponry. My next crisis that was very illuminating was in November of 2010. Most of you probably have forgotten it or may not have paid a lot of attention to it, but you never want to be gotten out of a meeting with a note that says, "Forward posts on the Northwest Islands under heavy artillery fire," which is exactly what happened. 2010, November, Northwest Islands, which are in what the Koreans call the West Sea, or what you know as the Yellow Sea, are the delineation of the agreed-upon UN border between North and South Korea out in the water. And they are islands that are mostly made of rock and support fishing villages to recover blue crabs of all things. And these are highly contested islands. There are naval skirmishes continuously between the North and the South. This day was a bit different, though. South Koreans were doing a well-advertised live fire away from North Korean territory, so into the southern waters, not aiming at the North Koreans for whatever. And the North Koreans decided to respond, and they fired back. They initially fired on South Korean artillery positions that were conducting the live fire. The South Koreans, not knowing exactly where the fire came from, decided that they needed to return fire and returned based off their standard operating procedures and shot at a separate North Korean artillery battery that had not been in the fire to begin with. That commander then takes upon himself to shoot back as well, and he hits his pre-planned target, which was a village on Waipido Island, resulting in the death of 2 Korean civilians and some amazing photography from camera phones that showed the village on fire. The month that followed after that was probably the closest the United States has been to war on the Korean Peninsula since 1994 with the first nuclear crisis. Partially because our allies, the Republic of Korea, had a bloodlust and wanted revenge, and possibly rightfully so. The crisis that ensued took the national security apparatus from both the Republic of Korea, the United States, Japan, and the United Kingdom to come together to try and find some course of action that was going to allow us to get out of this situation. And the interesting thing about it, when we did the post-mortem on this environment, is we saw this coming. We watched it happen. We watched the North Koreans deploy their forces. We watched them rehearse. We watched them do completely uncharacteristic patterns that said they are going to do something in the Northwest Islands. But we just could not believe that they would actually go ahead and do it. And we watched it happen. And on one fateful day in a national security VTC with General Sharp, who was the U.S. Army General Commanding of U.S. Forces Korea, we're talking to the National Security Council, which included that day members of the Cabinet, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Vice President, Chairman, and Vice Chairman, and National Security Advisor, of course. And then in walks the President, President Obama. And he listened dutifully for a good 15, 20 minutes, and then left. And while there were a variety of reasons for him leaving without giving any direction, the lack of direction in that National Security Council meeting, to which Secretary Clinton actually said, and maybe this came back to haunt the president later, hey, there are no red lines here. We've made no stated red lines. But as the president left, there was no direction, which allowed everyone in that room to come up with their own direction. And all orders were coming to U.S. Forces Korea. So there were orders to develop targets of these locations in North Korea. And then there were orders to not do anything to aggravate the North Koreans. And the conflicting orders that came through were legion until finally we were able to get clear direction from the president on where we wanted to go. But it was, and you would expect, I could take any 10 of you from this room, and your ability to deal with that crisis would have been at the same level of the people that were in that room on that day, which was a bit shocking for a junior senior officer at that time. The last vignette I will leave you with was as director of the air operations in the Middle East in 2011. This is an everyday crisis. This was not a normal crisis. But I was responsible for running all of the day-to-day combat air operations from the Pakistani border all the way to the Horn of Africa, which involved at that time, of course, combat operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, counter-terrorist operations in Yemen, on the Arabian Peninsula, and also some of our counter-terrorist operations on the Horn of Africa. But during this time, we realized that it was time to start shifting our thought process to defense of the Arabian Gulf against Iranian provocations. The Iranian nuclear program was continuing, and the Syrian civil war was just starting, and we were forced to shift everything we were doing to be able to still deal with the emerging threats. However, at the same time, we were forced to continue with our support of the combat operations that were ongoing. It was quite an eye-opener to try and carve out from the staff a group, an organization that was going to be able to spend the time necessary to figure out how to divide the resources that were already limited in a combat theater to be able to cover what we needed to cover. But yet still go about our daily lives. And the daily lives of combat operations at the staff is significant, to include putting orders out for every aircraft every day for 24 hours at a time, and it is an ongoing sausage mill that does not stop every single day, to include Christmas, unfortunately, or New Year's, or whatever holiday you want to pick. To be able to have to be given no additional manpower, no additional resources, and have to come up with plans and contingencies to deal with what could possibly be a major regional conflict that could include weapons of mass destruction was shocking, but it's what we had to do. And as we started to do it for Iran and how we were going to defend the Arabian Gulf against any Iranian incursion across to the Gulf states, we get asked the question, what can you do in Syria? Perhaps having not had sleep in a very long time, perhaps having been in the desert too long, or perhaps just getting a little too crotchety, I was able to look back at the 3-star, and I was a 1-star, the 3-star at the time when he said, hey, we've got to ask what can we do in Syria. And my first thought was, first, we don't realize what's in Syria. That's a real air defense. That's a real military. It's not, going into Afghanistan. Second, how many airplanes do you plan on giving me? Because I can't do what you want me to do now. We just had a friendly fire incident with Pakistan, and the Pakistanis were threatening to take retaliation against the United States for killing 25 Pakistani soldiers. The war was ongoing in Afghanistan. We weren't completely out of Iraq yet. We're doing counter-terrorist operations in Yemen, and we're also operating off the Horn of Africa to deal with Somali pirates and their link now to al-Qaeda. And you want me to do what? To which I replied, General, I can do 3 wars. I can't do 4. But if you want to get me reinforcements, we might be able to work something out. And that ended up on my going away plaque. I can't do 4 wars. I can only do 3. So, but we had to carve out of the staff to be able to do that and then brief the National Security Council on what our options in Iran were should anything happen. There are lessons from this, and you are all very bright and successful business people, so you've probably culled through some of the lessons already that I think apply to you. The first one is information flow. Somewhere in your organization today, that 23-year-old intelligence analyst is working hard away, and he or she knows what your next big surprise is going to be. Do they have the avenue to get that information to you? And have you created the environment that's going to allow them to do that? Complacency. You're watching competitors. You are watching colleagues, competitors, or whoever in the marketplace, in whatever your field is. Are you watching it with open eyes, or are you complacent to your own success or to your own challenges? Direction. If you are the senior leader of your organization, then please, for the, I normally say for the love of Allah, but I don't want to, it's kind of an inside military joke, but please give direction. When you leave a meeting, tell them either this is the direction or I'm still thinking, but don't leave it open-ended because everybody underneath you will churn on that direction for a very long time. And sometimes it'll be in ways you don't want. And then lastly, make sure that you are positioned to, as you see opportunities, to take large shifts in your organization while still in contact with the enemy. Because that's exactly what we ended up having to do in the desert. And you might face the same thing as you shift from one product to another, from one area to another, one opportunity to another. You still have to conduct business, but you must shift away and be able to do it. Very successful. I've in my one data point in civilian life, I've seen that done very successfully. And hopefully you guys have got that lesson and will do so as well. And lastly, I'll leave you with this so hopefully I've given you something, at least some cool little stories, not as good as, bras and undergarments in the back of cabs. Those are Friday afternoon stories for fighter pilots. Yes, I'm going to remember that for forever. You kidding me? But so hopefully I've given you something, but then I'm going to charge you with something as well too, because I don't often get an opportunity to speak to such senior leaders as yourselves in the civilian world. The civilian world and the military world have become completely split. We live on our own bases, we live in our own societies. 1% of the US population, my age and below, serves in the military. You must make it your task to help senior military leaders such as Admiral Mullen, who was completely concerned about civil-military relations, to stay engaged with the military and the national security process. You also need to maintain awareness of the national security events. I know all politics are local. I know that everyone talks about the economy, which is its own national security issue, significantly so. But as we discuss things like Syria or Libya or U.S. strikes in Somalia, stay engaged. Be aware of these events because U.S. national security is a global problem these days. And no matter how well our own house might eventually be in order, we still have to deal with the world on an international way. And for a group such as you, whose fourth tenet is to further peace throughout the world, help in doing so by helping ensure that our elected leaders maintain the right approach to whatever U.S. national security will be in the future.